Part 1 of Chapter 2 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 2, Section 1. The Case Against Bobby. Bobby hurried down the road in the direction of the Cedars. Always he tried desperately to recall what had occurred during those black hours last night and this morning before he had awakened in the empty house near his grandfather's home. All that remained were his sensation of travel in a swift vehicle, his impression of standing in the forest near the Cedars, his glimpse of the masked figure which he had called his conscience, the echo in his brain of a dreamlike voice saying, "Take off your shoes and carry them in your hand. Always do that. It's the only safe way." These facts, then, alone were clear to him. He had wandered unconscious in the neighborhood. His grandfather had been strangely murdered. The detective who had met him in the village practically accused him of the murder. And he couldn't remember. He turned back to his last clear recollections. When he had experienced his first symptoms of slipping consciousness, he had been in the cafe in New York with Carlos Paredes, Maria the dancer, and the strange man whom Maria had brought to the table. Through them he might, to an extent, trace his movements, unless they had put him in a cab, thinking he would catch the train of which he had talked for the Cedars. Already the forest crowded the narrow, curving road. The Blackburn place was in the midst of an arid thicket of stunted pines, oaks, and cedars. Old Blackburn had never done anything to improve the estate or its surroundings. Steadily, during his lifetime, it had grown more gloomy, less habitable. With the silent forest thick about him, Bobby realized that he was no longer alone. A crackling twig or a loose stone struck by a foot might have warned him. He went slower, glancing restlessly over his shoulder. He saw no one, but that idea of stealthy pursuit persisted. Undoubtedly, it was the detective Howells, who followed him, hoping, perhaps, that he would make some mad effort at escape. "That," he muttered, "is probably the reason he didn't arrest me at the station." Bobby, however, had no thought of escape. He was impatient to reach the Cedars, where he might learn all that Howells hadn't told him about his grandfather's death. A high wooden fence straggled through the forest. The driveway swung from the road through a broad gateway. The gate stood open. Bobby remembered that it had been old Blackburn's habit to keep it closed. He entered and hurried among the trees to the edge of the lawn in the center of which the house stood. Feeling as guilty as the detective thought him, he paused there and examined the house for some sign of life. At first it seemed as dead as the forest stripped by autumn, almost as gloomy and arid as the wilderness which straggled close about it. He had no eye for the symmetry of its wings, which formed the court in the center of which an abandoned fountain stood. He studied the windows, picturing Catherine alone, surrounded by the complications of this unexpected tragedy. His feeling of an inimical watchfulness persisted. A clicking sound swung him back to the house. The front door had been opened, and in the black frame of the doorway, as he looked, Catherine and Graham appeared, and he knew the resolution of his last doubt was at hand. Catherine had thrown a cloak over her graceful figure. Her sunny hair strayed in the wind, but her face, while it had lost nothing of its beauty, projected even at this distance a sense of weariness, of anxiety, of utter fear. Bobby was grateful for Graham's presence. It was like the man to assume his responsibilities, to sacrifice himself in his service. He straightened. He must meet these two. Through his own wretched appearance and position, he must develop for Catherine more clearly than ever Graham's superiority. He stepped out, calling softly, "Catherine!" She started. She turned in his direction and came swiftly toward him. She spread her hands. "Bobby, Bobby, where have you been?" There were tears in her eyes. They were like tears that have been too long coming. He took her hands. Her fingers were cold. They twitched in his. "Look at me, Catherine," he said hoarsely. "I'm sorry." Graham came up. He spoke with apparent difficulty. "You've not been home. Then what happened last night? Quick, tell us what you did. Everything." "I've seen the detective," he answered. "He's told you too? Be careful. I think he's back there watching and listening." Catherine freed her hands. The tears had dried. She shook a little. "Then you were at the station," she said. "You must have come from New York. But I tried so hard to get you there. For hours I telephoned and telegraphed. Then I got Hartley. Come away from the trees so we can talk without being overheard." As they moved to the center of the open space, Graham indicated Bobby's evening clothes. "Why are you dressed like that, Bobby? You did come from town. You can tell us everything you did last night after I left you, and early this morning." Bobby shook his head. His answer was reluctant. "I didn't come from New York just now. I was evidently here last night, and I can't remember. Hartley, I remember scarcely anything." Graham's face whitened. "Tell us," he begged. "You've got to remember," Catherine cried. Bobby, as minutely as he could, recited the few impressions that remained from last night. When he had finished, Graham thought for some time. "Paredes and the dancer," he said at last, "practically forced me away from you last night. It's obvious, Bobby. You must have been drugged." Bobby shook his head. "I thought of that right away, but it won't do. If I had been drugged, I wouldn't have moved around, and I did come out somehow. I managed to get to the empty house to sleep. It's more as if my mind had simply closed, as if it had gone on working its own ends without my knowing anything about it. And that's dreadful, because the detective has practically accused me of murdering my grandfather. How was it done? You see, I know nothing. Tell me how. How he was killed. I can't believe I'm such a beast. Tell me, if I was in the house, some detail might start my memory." So Catherine told her story while Bobby listened, shrinking from some disclosure that would convict him. As she went on, however, his sense of bewilderment increased, and when she had finished, he burst out, "But where is the proof of murder? Where is there even a suggestion? You say the doors were locked and he doesn't show a mark?" "That's what we can't understand," Graham said. "There's no evidence we know anything about that. Your grandfather's heart didn't simply give out, but the detective is absolutely certain. And there's no use mincing matters, Bobby. He believes he has proof to convict you. He won't tell me what. He simply smiles and refuses to talk." "The motive?" Bobby asked. Graham looked at him curiously. Catherine turned away. "Of course," Bobby cried with a sharpened discomfort. "I'd forgotten. The money. The new will he had planned to make. The money's mine now, but if he had lived until this morning, it never would have been. I see." It is a powerful motive, Graham said, for anyone who doesn't know you. But, Bobby answered, Howells has got to prove first that my grandfather was murdered. The autopsy. Coroner's out of the county, Graham replied, and Howells won't have an assistant. Dr. Groom's waiting in the house. We're expecting the coroner almost any time. Bobby spoke rapidly. If he calls it murder, Hartley, there's one thing we've got to find out. What my grandfather was afraid of. Tell me again, Catherine, everything he said about me. I can't believe he could have been afraid of me. He called you, Catherine answered. A waster, he said. God knows what he'll do next. He said he'd ordered you out last night and he hadn't had a word from you, but that he'd made up his mind anyway. He was going to have his lawyer this morning and change his will, leaving all his money to the Bedford Foundation, except a little annuity for me. He grew sentimental and said he had no faith left in his flesh and blood, and that it was sad to grow old with nobody caring for him except to covet his money. I asked him if he were afraid of you, and all he answered was, You and Bobby are thicker than thieves. Oh, yes. When I saw him for the last time in the hall, he said there was nothing for me to worry about except you. That's all. I remember perfectly. He said nothing more about you. I wonder, Bobby muttered, if a jury wouldn't think it enough. Catherine shook her head. There seemed so much more than that behind his fear, she said. As I told you, he gave me a feeling of superstition. I never once was afraid of a murderer, of a man in the house. I was afraid of something queer and active, but not human. Bobby straightened. Would you, he asked, call a man going about in an aphasia quite human? Somnambulists do unaccountable things, such as overcoming locked doors. Don't, Bobby, don't, Catherine cried. Shh, quiet, Graham warned. A foot scraped on gravel. Maybe the detective, Bobby suggested. He stared at the bend, expecting to see the stiff, plain figure of the detective emerge from the forest. Instead, with a dawning amazement, he watched Carlos Paredes stroll into view. The Panamanian was calm and immaculate. His Van Dyke beard was neatly trimmed and combed. As he advanced, he puffed in leisurely fashion at a cigarette. Graham flushed. After last night, he has the nerve. Be decent to him, Bobby urged. He might help me. Might clear up last night. I wonder, Graham mused, to what extent he could clear it up if he wished. Paredes threw his cigarette away as he came closer. Solemnly, he shook hands with Catherine and Bobby, expressing a profound sympathy. Even then, Bobby remarked that those reserved features let slip no positive emotion. The man turned to Graham. Our little difference of last evening, he said suavely, will, I hope, evaporate in this atmosphere of unexpected sorrow. If I was in the wrong, I deeply regret it. My one wish now is to join you in being of use to Bobby and Miss Catherine in their bereavement. I saw the account in a paper at luncheon. I came as quickly as possible. Graham answered this smooth effrontery with a blunt question. Do you know that Bobby is in very real trouble, that he may be implicated in Mr. Blackburn's death? Paredes flung up his hands, but Bobby, looking for emotion in the sallow face, then found none. Paredes' features, it occurred to him, were exactly like a mask. Bobby checked himself. In his unhealthy way, Paredes had been a good friend. The man's voice flowed smoothly, demanding particulars. But this, he said, when they had told him what they could, changes the situation. I must stay here. I must watch that detective and learn what he has up his sleeve. Graham turned away. I've tried. Maybe you'll succeed better than I. Then you'll excuse me, Paredes said quickly. I should like your permission to telephone to my hotel in New York for some clothing. I want to see this through. The three looked at each other. Catherine and Graham seemed about to speak. Bobby wouldn't let them. Carlos, he said, you might help me. I'm almost afraid to ask. What happened in the cafe last night? The last thing I remember distinctly is sitting there with you and Maria and a stranger she had introduced. I didn't get his name. What did I do? Did anyone leave the place with me? Paredes smiled a little, shaking his head. You behaved as if Mr. Graham's earlier fears had been accomplished. You insisted you were going to catch your train. I didn't think it wise, so I went to the cloakroom with you, intending to see you home. Somehow, just the same, you gave me the slip. You oughtn't to have let him get away, Graham said. Paredes shrugged his shoulders. You weren't there. You don't know how sly Bobby was. I suppose it's useless to ask, Graham said. You saw nothing put in his wine. Paredes laughed. Is it likely? Certainly not. I should have mentioned it. I should have stopped such a thing. What do you think I am, Mr. Graham? Sorry, Graham said. You must understand we can't let any lead slip. This stranger Maria brought up. I didn't catch his name, Paredes answered. I'd never seen him before. I gather he was a friend of hers, connected with the profession. Now I shall telephone with your permission, Miss Catherine, and don't you worry, Bobby. I will see you through, but we can't do much until the coroner comes, until the detective can be made to talk. Catherine hesitated for a moment, then she surrendered. Please go with him, Hartley, and make him as comfortable as you can in this unhappy house. Catherine detained Bobby with a nod. He saw the others go. He shrank in his mental and physical discomfort from his isolation with her. As soon as the door was closed, she touched his hand. She burst out passionately. I don't believe it, Bobby. I'll never believe it, no matter what happens. It's sweet of you, Catherine, he said huskily. That helps when you don't know what to believe yourself. Don't talk that way. Such a crime would never have entered your head under any conditions. Only, Bobby, it ought never to have happened. You ought never to have been in this position. Why have you been friendly with people like that Spaniard? What can he want forcing himself here? At any rate, you'll never lead that sort of life again. Her fingers sought his. He clasped them firmly. If I get past this, he said, I'll always look you straight in the eye, Catherine. It was mad, silly. You don't quite understand. He broke off, glancing at the door through which Graham had disappeared. Then remember, she said softly, I don't believe it. She released his hand, sighing. That's all I can say, all I can do now. You're ill, Bobby. Go in, rest for a while. When you've had sleep, you may remember something. He shook his head. He walked slowly with her to the house. As he climbed the stairs, he heard Paredes telephoning. He couldn't understand the man's insistence on remaining where he clearly was an intruder. He entered his bedroom, which he had occupied only once or twice during the last few months. The place seemed unfamiliar. As he bathed and dressed, his sense of strangeness grew, and he understood why. The last time he had been here, he had stood in no personal danger. There had been no black parenthesis in his life during the stretch of which he might have committed an unspeakable crime. for he couldn't believe as firmly as Catherine did. Since he couldn't remember, he might have done anything. "Come," he called in response to a stealthy rapping at the door. Stealth, it occurred to him, had since last night become a stern condition of his life. Graham entered and noiselessly closed the door. "I had a chance to slip in," he explained. "Paredes is wandering about the place. I'd give a lot to know what he's after at the Cedars. Catherine is in her room, trying to rest after last night, I fancy." "And," Bobby asked, "the detective, Howells?" "If he's back from the station," Graham answered, "he's keeping low. I wonder if it was he or Paredes who followed you through the woods." "Why should Carlos have followed me?" Bobby asked. "I've been thinking it over, Hartley. It isn't a bad scheme having him here, since you think he hasn't told all he knows." "I don't say that," Graham answered. "I don't know what to think about Paredes. I've come to talk about just that. I'm a lawyer, and I've had some criminal practice. Since this detective will be satisfied with you for a victim, I'm going to take your case, if you'll have me. I'll be your detective as well as your lawyer." Bobby was a good deal touched. "That's kind of you, more than I deserve, for I have resented you at times." Graham, it was clear, didn't guess he referred to his friendship for Catherine, for he answered quickly, "I must have seemed a nuisance, but I was only trying to get you back on the straight path where you've always belonged. I can't believe you did this thing, even unconsciously, until I'm shown proof without a single flaw. Until the autopsy, the only thing we have to work on is that party last night. I've telephoned to New York and put a trustworthy man on the heels of Maria and the stranger. Meantime, I think I'd better watch developments here." "Please," Bobby agreed, "stay with me, Hartley, until this man takes some definite action." He picked at the fringe of the window curtain. "If the autopsy shows that my grandfather was murdered," he said, "either I killed him or else someone has deliberately tried to throw suspicion on me. For with only a motive to go on, this detective wouldn't be so sure. Why in the name of heaven should anyone kill the old man, place all this money in my hands, and at the same time send me to the electric chair? Don't you see how absurd it is that Carlos, Maria, or anyone else should have had a hand in it? There was nothing for them to gain from his death. I've thought and thought in such circles until I am almost convinced of the logic of my guilt." He drew the curtain further back and gazed across the court at the room where his grandfather lay dead. One of the two windows of the room was a little raised, but the blinds were closely drawn. "I did hate him," he mused. "There's that. Ever since I can remember, he did things to make me despise him. Have you seen him?" Graham nodded. "Howells took me in. He looked perfectly normal. Not a mark." "I don't want to see him," Bobby said. End of Chapter 2, Section 1 of The Abandoned Room. Part 2 of Chapter 2 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 2, Section 2. He drew back from the window, pointing. The detective Howells had strolled into the court. His hands hung at his sides. They didn't swing as he walked. His lips were stretched in that thin, straight smile. He paused by the fountain, glancing for a moment anxiously downward. Then he came on and entered the house. "He'll be restless," Graham said, "until the coroner comes and proves or disproves his theory of murder. If he questions you, you'd better say nothing for the present. From his point of view, what you remember of last night would be only damaging." "I want him to leave me alone," Bobby said. "If he doesn't arrest me, I won't have him bullying me." Jenkins knocked and entered. The old butler was as white-faced as Bobby, more tremulous. "The policeman, sir. He's asking for you." "Tell him I don't wish to see him." The detective himself stepped from the obscurity of the hall, smiling his queer smile. "Ah, you are here, Mr. Blackburn. I'd like a word with you." He turned to Graham and Jenkins. "Alone, if you please." Bobby mutely agreed, and Graham and the butler went out. The detective closed the door and leaned against it, studying Bobby with his narrow eyes. "I don't suppose," he began, "that there's any use asking you about your movements last night." "None," Bobby answered jerkily, "unless you arrest me and take me before those who ask questions with authority." The detective's smile widened. "No matter. I didn't come to argue with you about that. I was curious to know if you tried to see your grandfather's body." Bobby shook his head. "I took it for granted the room was locked." "Yes," the detective answered, "but some people, it seems, have skillful ways of overcoming locks." He moved to one side, placing his hand on the doorknob. "I've come to open doors for you, to give you the opportunity an affectionate grandson must crave." Bobby hesitated, fighting back his feeling of repulsion, his first instinct to refuse. The detective might take it as an evidence against him. On the other hand, if he went, the man would unquestionably try to tear from a meeting between the living and the dead some valuable confirmation of his theory. "Well," the detective said, "what's the matter?" "Thought the least I could do was to give you a chance." "Wouldn't do it for everybody." "Then everybody hasn't your affectionate nature," Bobby advanced. "For God's sake, stop mocking me. I'll go, since you wish." The detective opened the door and stood aside to let Bobby pass. "Dare say you know the room, the way to it." Bobby didn't answer. He went along the corridor and into the main hall where Catherine had met Silas Blackburn last night. He fought back his aversion and entered the corridor of the old wing. He heard the detective behind him. He was aware of the man's narrow eyes watching him with a malicious assurance. Bobby, with a feeling of discomfort, sprung in part from the gloomy passageway, paused before the door his grandfather had had the unaccountable whim of entering last night. The detective took a key from his pocket and inserted it in the lock. "Had some trouble repairing the lock this morning," he said. "That fellow, Jenkins, entered with a heavy hand, a good deal heavier than whoever was here before him." He opened the door. "Queerest case I've ever seen," he mumbled. "Step in, Mr. Blackburn." Because of the drawn blinds, the room was nearly as dark as the corridor. Bobby entered slowly, his nerves taut. Against the farther wall, the bed was like an enormous shadow without form. "Stay where you are," the detective warned, "until I give you more light. You know I wouldn't want you to touch anything, because the room is exactly as it was when he was murdered." Bobby experienced a swift impulse to strangle the brutal word in the detective's throat, but he stood still while the man went to the bureau, struck a match, and applied it to a candle. The wick burned reluctantly. It flickered in the wind that slipped past the curtains of the open window. "Come here," the detective commanded roughly. Bobby dragged himself forward until he stood at the foot of the four-poster bed. The detective lifted the candle and held it beneath the canopy. "You look all you want now, Mr. Robert Blackburn," he said grimly. Bobby conquered the desire to close his eyes, to refuse to obey. He stared at his grandfather, and a feeling of wonder grew upon him. For Silas Blackburn rested peacefully in the great bed. His eyes were closed. The thick gray brows were no longer gathered in the frown too familiar to Bobby. The face with its gray beard retained no fear, no record of a great shock. Bobby glanced at the detective, who bent over the bed, watching him out of his narrow eyes. "Why," he asked simply, "do you say he was murdered?" "He was murdered," the detective answered. "Murdered in cold blood. And look you here, young fellow, I know who did it. I'm going to strap that man in the electric chair. He's got just one chance. If he talks out, if he makes a clean breast of it." Across the body he bent closer. He held the candle so that its light searched Bobby's face instead of the dead man's, and the uncertain flame was like an ambush for his eyes. In response to those intolerable words, Bobby's sick nerves stretched too tight. No masquerade remained before this huntsman who had his victim trapped and calmly studied his agony. The horror of the accusation shot at him across the body of the man he couldn't be sure he hadn't murdered, robbed him of his last control. He cried out hysterically, "Why don't you do something? For God's sakes, why don't you arrest me?" A chuckle came from the man in ambush behind the yellow flame. "Listen to the boy. What's he talking about? Grief for his grandfather? That's what it is. Grief." "Stop!" Bobby shouted. "It's what you've been accusing me with ever since you stopped me at the station." He indicated the silent form of the old man. "You keep telling me I murdered him. Why don't you arrest me then? Why don't you lock me up? Why don't you put the case on a reasonable basis?" He waited, trembling. The flame continued to flicker, but the hand holding the candlestick failed to move, and Bobby knew that the eyes didn't waver either. He forced his glance from the searching flame. He managed to lower and steady his voice. "You can't. That's the trouble. He wasn't murdered. The coroner will tell you so. Anybody who looks at him will tell you so. Since you haven't the nerve to arrest me, I'm going. I'm glad to have had this out with you. Understand, I'm my own master. I do what I please. I go where I please." At last the candle moved to one side. The detective straightened and walked to Bobby. The multitude of small lines in his face twitched. His voice was too cold for the fury of his words. "That's just what I wanted you to do. Damn you. Anything you please. I'm accusing nobody, but I'm getting somebody. I've got somebody right now for this old man's murder. My man's going to writhe and burn in the chair. Confession or no confession. Now get out of this room since you're so anxious, and don't come near it again." Bobby went. At the end of the corridor he heard the closing of the door, the scraping of the key. He was afraid the detective might follow him to his room to heckle him further. To avoid that he hurried to the lower floor. He wanted to be alone. He must have time to accustom himself to this degrading fate which loomed in the too close future. Unless they could demolish the detective's theory, he, Bobby Blackburn, would go to the death house. A fire blazed in the big hall fireplace. Paredes stood with his back to it, smoking and warming his hands. A man sat in the shadow of a deep leather chair, his rough, unpolished boots stretched toward the flaming logs. As he came down the stairs, Bobby heard the heavy, rumbling voice of the man in the chair. Certainly it's a queer case, but not the way Howells means. I dare say the old fool died what the world will call a natural death. If you smoke so much, you will, too, before long. Bobby tried to slip past, but Paredes saw him. Feeling better, Bobby? The boots were drawn in. From the depths of the chair arose a figure nearly gigantic in the firelight. The man's face, at first glance, appeared to be covered with hair, black and curling. It straggled over his forehead, it circled his mouth, and fell in an unkempt beard down his waistcoat. The huge man must have been as old as Silas Blackburn, but he showed no touch of grey. His only concession to age was the sunken and bloodshot appearance of his eyes. Bobby and Catherine had always been afraid of this great grim country practitioner who had attended their childish illnesses. That sense of an overpowering and incomprehensible personality had lingered. Even through his graver fear, Bobby felt a sharp discomfort as he surrendered his hand to the other's absorbing grasp. "I'm afraid you came too late this time, Dr. Groom." The doctor looked him up and down. "Not for you, I guess," he grumbled. "Don't you know you're sick, boy?" Bobby shook his head. "I'm very tired, that's all. I'm on my way to the library to try to rest." He freed his hand. The big man nodded approvingly. "I'll send you a dose," he promised. "And don't you worry about your grandfather's having been murdered by any man. I've seen the body. Stuff and nonsense. Detective's an ass. Waiting for coroner, although I know he's one too." "I pray," Bobby answered listlessly, "that you're right. If there's any little thing I can do," Paredes offered formally. No, thanks," Bobby answered. He went on to the library. He glanced with an unpleasant shrinking from the door of the enclosed staircase leading to the private hall just outside the room in which his grandfather lay dead. There was no fire here, but he wrapped himself in a rug and lay on the broad, high-backed lounge which was drawn close to the fireplace, facing it. His complete weariness conquered his premonitions, his feelings of helplessness. The entrance of Jenkins barely aroused him. "Where are you, Mr. Robert?" "Here," Bobby answered sleepily. The butler walked to the lounge and looked over the back. "To be sure, sir. I didn't see you here." He held out a glass. "Dr. Groom said you were to drink this. It would make you sleep, sir." Bobby closed his eyes again. "Put it on the table where I can reach it when I want it." "Yes, sir, Mr. Robert." "The policeman. Did he say anything?" "If I might be so bold as to ask?" "Go away," Bobby groaned. "Leave me in peace." And peace for a little time came to him. It was the sound of voices in the rooms that aroused him. He lay for a while, scarcely knowing where he was, but little by little the sickening truth came back, and he realized that it was Graham and the detective, Howells, who talked close to the window, and Graham had already fulfilled his promise. Bobby didn't want to eavesdrop, but it was patent he would embarrass Graham by disclosing himself now, and it was likely Graham would be glad of a witness to anything the detective might say. It was still light. A ray from the low sun entered the window and rested on the door of the enclosed staircase. Graham's anxious demand was the first thing Bobby heard distinctly, the thing that warned him to remain secreted. "I think now, with the coroner on his way, it's time you defined your suspicions a trifle more clearly. I am a lawyer. In a sense, I represent young Mr. Blackburn. Please tell me why you are so sure his grandfather was murdered." "All right," the detective's level voice came back. "Half an hour ago I would have said no again, but now I've got the evidence I wanted. I appreciate, Mr. Graham, that you're a friend of that young rascal, and what I have to say isn't pleasant for a friend to hear. But first, you want to know why I'm so sure the case is murder, in spite of the doctor who made his diagnosis without really looking. Go on, Graham said softly. Bobby waited, his nerves as tense as they had grown in the presence of the dead man. 2 days ago, the detective went on quietly, old Mr. Blackburn came to the courthouse in Smithtown and asked for the best detective the district attorney could put his hand on. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I've got away with 1 or 2 pretty fair jobs. I've had good offers from private firms in New York, so they turned him over to me. It was easy to see the old man was scared, just as his niece says he was last night. The funny part was he wouldn't say definitely what he was afraid of. I thought he might be shielding somebody until he was a little surer of his ground. He told me he was afraid of being murdered, and he wanted a good man he could call on to come out here to the Cedars if things got too hot for him. I can hear his voice now as distinctly as if he was standing where you are. My heart's all right, he said. It won't stop a while yet unless it's made to. So if I'm found cold some fine morning, you can be sure I was put out of the way. I tried to pump him, naturally, but he wouldn't say another word except that he'd send for me if there was time. He didn't want any fuss made, and he gave me a handsome present to keep my mouth shut and not to bother him with any more questions. I figured, you can't blame me, Mr. Graham, that the old boy was a little cracked, so I took his money and let it go at that. I didn't think much more about it until they told me early this morning he lay dead here under peculiar circumstances. Odd, Graham commented. It does make it more like murder, Howells. But he doesn't look like a murdered man. When you know as much about crime as I do, Mr. Graham, you'll realize that murders which are a long time planning are likely to take on one of 2 appearances: suicide or natural death. All right, Graham said, for the purpose of argument, let us agree it's murder. Even so, why do you suspect young Blackburn? Without a scrap of evidence, it's plain as the nose on your face, the detective answered. If old Blackburn had lived until this morning, our young man would have been a pauper. As it is, he's a millionaire, but I don't think he'll enjoy his money. The 2 had been at sword's point for a long time. Robert hated the old man, never made any bones about it. You couldn't ask for a more damaging motive. You can't convict a man on motive, Graham said shortly. You spoke of evidence. More, the detective replied, than any jury in the land would ask. Bobby held his breath, shrinking from this information, which, however, he realized it was better he should know. When I got here, the detective said, I decided on the theory of murder to make a careful search as soon as day broke. I didn't have to wait for day, though, to find one crying piece of evidence. For a long time I was alone in the room with the body. Queer feeling about that room, Mr. Graham. Don't know how to describe it except to say it's uncomfortable. Too old, maybe. Maybe it was just being there alone with the dead men before the dawn, although I thought I was hardened to that sort of thing. Anyway, I didn't like it. To keep my spirits up as well as to save time, I commenced searching the place with a candle. Nothing about the bed, nothing in the closets or the bureau. He grinned sheepishly. You know, I kind of was afraid to open the closet doors. Then I got on my knees and looked under the bed. The light was bad, and I didn't see anything at first. After a minute, close against the wall, I noticed something white. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a handkerchief, and it had a monogram, Mr. Graham, R.B. in purple and green. He paused. Graham exclaimed sharply. Bobby felt the net tighten. If that evidence was conclusive to the others, how much more so was it for him? He recalled how, after awakening in the empty house, he had searched unsuccessfully in all his pockets for his handkerchief, intending to brush the dirt from his shoes. "I went to his room," the detective hurried on, "and found a lot of his clothes and his stationery and his toilet articles marked with the same cipher. I knew my man had made a big mistake. The sort of mistake every criminal makes no matter how clever he is, and I had him. But that isn't by any means all. Don't look so distressed, Mr. Graham. There isn't the slightest chance for him. You see, I repaired the lock, and as soon as it was day, closed the room and went outside to look for signs. Since nightfall, no one had come legitimately through the court except Dr. Groom and myself. Our footprints were all right, making a straight line along the path to the front door. In the soft earth by the fountain, I found another and a smaller print, made by a very neat shoe, sir, and I said to myself, there is almost certainly the footprint of the murderer. There were plenty of others coming across the grass. He evidently avoided the path, and there was one directly under the open window where the body lies. It's still there. Perhaps you can see it. No matter. That's the last one I found. The print ceased there. There wasn't a one going back, and I was fair up a stump. Then I saw a little undefined sign of pressure on the grass, and I got an idea. Suppose, I say, my man took his shoes off and went around in his stockinged feet. I couldn't understand, though, why he hadn't thought of that before. I went back to Robert Blackburn's room and got one of his shoes, and ran into a snag again. The sole of the shoe was a trifle larger than the footprints. Every one of his shoes I tried was the same way. I argued that the handkerchief was enough, but I wanted this other evidence. I simply had to clear up these queer footprints. I figured, since the murder had been made to look so much like a natural death, that he'd come out here sometime today, expecting to carry it off. I wanted to go to the station, anyway, to find out if he'd been seen coming through last night or early this morning. While I was talking to the station agent, I had my one piece of luck. I couldn't believe my eyes. Mr. Roberts walks up from the woods. He'd been hiding around the neighborhood all the time. Probably had missed his handkerchief and decided he'd better not take any chances. Yet it must have seemed a pretty sure thing that the station wouldn't be watched. And it's those nervy things, doing the obvious, that skillful criminals get away with all the time. I needed only one look at him, and I had the answer to the mystery of the footprints. I gave him plenty of time to come here and change his clothes. Then I maneuvered him out of his room and went there and found the pumps he'd worn last night and today. You see, they'd be a little smaller than his ordinary shoes. Not only did they fit the footprints exactly, but they were stained with soil exactly like that in the court. There you are, sir. I made a plaster cast of one of the prints. I've got it here in my pocket, where I intend to keep it until I clear the whole case up and turn in my report. Graham's tone was shocked and discouraged. What more do you want? Why haven't you arrested him? In this room, the detective's satisfied chuckle was an offense. No good detective would ask that, Mr. Graham. I want my report clean. The coroner will tell us how the old man was killed. I want to tell you how young Blackburn got into that room. One of the windows was raised a trifle, but that's no use. I figured on the outside of the wing until I'm dizzy. There's no way up for a normal man. An orangutan would make hard work of it. His latchkey would have let him into the house, and it would have been simple enough for him to find out that the old man had changed his room. I've got to find out how he got past those doors, locked on the inside." He chuckled again, almost like a sleepwalker's work. Bobby shivered. Was that where the evidence pointed? Already the net was too finely woven. The detective continued earnestly. "I'm figuring on some scheme to make him show me the way. I've sort of a plan for tonight, but it's only a chance." "What?" Graham asked. "Oh, no, sir." Howells laughed. "You'll learn about that when the time comes." "I don't understand you," Graham said. "You're sure of your man, but you keep no close watch on him. Do you know where he is now?" "Haven't the slightest idea, Mr. Graham." "What's to prevent his running away?" "I'm offering him every opportunity. He wouldn't get far, and I've a feeling that if he confessed by running, he'd break down and give up the whole thing." "You've no idea how it frets me, Mr. Graham. I've got my man practically in the chair. But from a professional point of view, it isn't a pretty piece of work until I find out how he got in and out of that room. The thing seems impossible, and yet here we are, knowing that he did it. Well, maybe I'll find out tonight. Hello." The door opened. Bobby, from his hiding place, could see Paredes on the threshold, yawning and holding a cigarette in his fingers. "Here you are," he said drowsily. "I've just been in the court. It made me seek company. The court's too damp, Mr. Detective." His laugh was lackadaisical. "When the sun leaves it, the court seems full of unfriendly things, what the ignorant would call ghosts. I'm Spanish, and I know." The detective grunted. "Funny," Paredes went on. "Observation doesn't seem to interest you. I'd rather fancied it might." He yawned again and put his cigarette to his lips. Puffing placidly, he turned and left. "What do you suppose he means by that?" the detective said to Graham. Without waiting for an answer, he followed Paredes from the room. Graham went after him. Bobby threw back the rug and arose. For a moment he was as curious as the others as to Paredes' intention. He slipped across the dining room. The hall was deserted. The front door stood open. From the court came Paredes' voice, even, languid, wholly without expression. "Mean to tell me you don't react to the proximity of unaccountable forces here, Mr. Howells?" The detective's laugh was disagreeable. "You're trying to make a fool of me. That isn't healthy." As Bobby hurried across the hall and up the stairs, he heard Paredes answer. "You should speak to Dr. Groom. He says this place is too crowded by the unpleasant past." Bobby climbed out of hearing. He entered his bedroom and locked the door. He resented Paredes' words and attitude, which he defined as studied to draw humor out of a tragic and desperate situation. He thought of them in no other way. His tired mind dismissed them. He threw himself on the bed, muttering, "If I run away, I'm done for. If I stay, I'm done for." He took a fierce, twisted joy in one phase of the situation. "If I was there last night," he thought, "Howells would never find out how I got into the room, because, no matter what trap he sets, I can't tell him." His leaden weariness closed his eyes. For a few minutes he slept again. Once more it was a voice that awakened him, this time a woman's, raised in a scream. He sprang up, flung open the door, and stumbled into the corridor. Catherine stood there, holding her dressing gown about her with trembling hands. The face she turned to Bobby was white and panic-stricken. She beckoned, and he followed her to the main hall. The others came tearing up the stairs: Graham, Paredes, the detective, and the black and gigantic doctor. In answer to their quick questions, she whispered breathlessly, "I heard. It was just like last night. It came across the court and stole in at my window." She shook. She stretched out her hands in a terrified appeal. Something moved in that room where he's dead. "Nonsense," the detective said. "Both doors are locked and I have the keys in my pocket." Paredes fumbled with a cigarette. "You're forgetting what I said about my sensitive apprehension of strange things." The detective interrupted him loudly, confidently. "I tell you the room is empty except for the murdered man, unless someone's broken down a door." Catherine cried out, "No, I heard the same stirring. Something moved in there." The detective turned brusquely and entered the old corridor. "We'll see." The others followed. Catherine was close to Bobby. He touched her hand. "He's right, Catherine. No one's there. No one could have been there. You mustn't give way like this. I'm depending on you, on your faith." She pressed his hand, but her assurance didn't diminish. The key scraped in the lock. They crowded through the doorway after the detective. He struck a match and lighted the candle. He held it over the bed. He sprang back with a sharp cry, unlike his level quality, his confident conceit. He pointed. They all approximated his helpless gesture, his blank amazement, for on the bed had occurred an abominable change. The body of Silas Blackburn no longer lay peacefully on its back. It had been turned on its side and remained in a stark and awkward attitude. For the first time, the back of the head was disclosed. Their glances focused there, on the tiny round hole at the base of the brain, on the pillow where the head had rested, and which they saw now was stained with an ugly and irregular splotch of blood. Bobby saw the candle quiver at last in the detective's hand. The man strode to the door leading to the private hall and examined the lock. "Both doors," he said, "were locked. There was no way in." He turned to the others, spreading his hands in justification. The candle, which he seemed to have forgotten, cast gross moving shadows over his face and over the face of the dead man. "At least you'll all grant me now that he was murdered." They continued to stare at the body of Silas Blackburn. Cold for many hours, it was as if he had made this atrocious revealing movement to assure them that he had, indeed, been murdered, to expose to their startled eyes the sly and deadly method. End of Chapter 2, Section 2 of The Abandoned Room.